Kirk Douglas and Marlene Dietrich. Two names that defined Hollywood power. Two egos that could destroy careers with a single word. In 1949, they met backstage at a studio party in Los Angeles. 3 days later, both of them had changed forever. For 70 years, nobody knew what really happened. Studio records had mysterious gaps. Personal letters were destroyed. Anyone who asked questions was told to stay quiet. Kirk married in bide-ins and stayed silent for 60 years. Marlene, who never kept secrets about her affairs, refused to talk about Kirk Douglas until the day she died. Then in 2019, researchers in Paris found a letter hidden in Marlene's private collection. What she had written 70 years ago would finally reveal the truth about those 3 days, and why two of Hollywood's most powerful stars spent their entire lives making sure this story stayed buried. Before we continue with this incredible story, please subscribe to our channel. We bring you the untold stories of Hollywood's golden age that you won't find anywhere else. Los Angeles, March 1949. The war was over, Hollywood was booming, and Kirk Douglas was on the edge of everything he'd ever wanted. At 32 years old, he'd already proven himself in Champion, the boxing drama that earned him his first Oscar nomination. Studio executives were calling him the next big thing. Directors wanted him. Producers fought over him. But Kirk Douglas wasn't satisfied with almost making it. He wanted more. He wanted to be untouchable. He wanted to be a legend. The kind of star whose name alone could open a picture. The kind of power that meant nobody could ever tell him no again. Marlene Dietrich didn't enter rooms. She claimed them. At 47, she was still one of the most magnetic women in the world. She'd conquered Berlin's cabaret scene, fled Nazi Germany, become a Hollywood icon, and collected lovers the way other people collected autographs. Men and women both fell under her spell. She answered to nobody. Her marriage to Rudolf Sieber had long since become an arrangement of convenience while they both lived separate lives. Marlene wore a perfectly tailored suit that night, her hair styled in the classic waves that had become her trademark, and when her eyes swept across the room and landed on Kirk Douglas, something shifted in the air. Kirk felt it immediately, that particular kind of attention from someone who understood power the same way he did. They'd never met before, but they knew of each other. Hollywood was a small town dressed up as an empire. Marlene excused herself from the group of studio executives. She'd been charming and walked directly toward him. The producer Kirk had been talking to suddenly remembered he needed to be somewhere else. Kirk watched her approach, his pulse quickening in a way that had nothing to do with nervousness and everything to do with recognition. When two apex predators meet, there's a moment of calculation. Fight or flight, or something else entirely. They talked about performance, about the lies Hollywood demanded and the truths they buried, about ambition and what it cost to feed it. Kirk found himself saying things he normally kept locked away. Marlene listened with an intensity that felt almost dangerous. She understood. That was the terrifying part. She understood exactly who he was because she was the same. And somewhere between the second bottle of wine and the moment she put on a record of Edith Piaf singing about lost love, the conversation shifted into something neither of them could take back. Kirk Douglas had been with other women. He'd had affairs, casual encounters, relationships that burned hot and faded fast. But this was different. Marlene wasn't interested in his fame or his future. She wanted the part of him that he normally kept hidden, the ruthless ambition, the willingness to do whatever it took to win, the darkness that came from growing up with nothing and swearing you'd never be powerless again. She saw all of it and wasn't frightened. She matched it with her own ferocity, her own refusal to ever be controlled or diminished by anyone. For 3 days, they barely left their house. The rest of Hollywood might as well have disappeared. They talked, they argued, they explored a connection that felt simultaneously inevitable and impossible. About the loneliness of being the kind of woman who refused to play by anyone else's rules. About the lovers she'd taken and left behind, searching for someone who could match her intensity without trying to cage it. They both knew it couldn't last. Kirk was technically still involved with someone, a relationship that was heading towards something serious. Marlene had her own complications, her own life that she'd carefully constructed to give herself maximum freedom. But more than that, they both recognized something fundamental. What they had together was too intense, too consuming. It would burn them both out. Kirk Douglas was building a career that demanded his complete focus. Marlene Dietrich had no interest in being anyone's partner in the traditional sense. They were too similar. Two stars can't orbit each other. Eventually, one would destroy the other, or they'd both burn out trying. On the third day, Marlene made the decision. Kirk woke up to find her already dressed, sitting at her desk, writing. She looked up when he entered the room, and something in her expression told him this was the end. "I'm writing you a letter," she said simply, "because if I don't put this in words, I'll convince myself it never happened." Kirk sat down, his characteristic confidence suddenly gone. "Marlene," she held up a hand, "let me finish this. Then we'll talk." He watched her write for another 20 minutes. Her handwriting was elegant, precise, the words flowing across the page in a way that suggested she'd been thinking about this all night. When she finally set down the pen, she folded the letter carefully and placed it in an envelope. But she didn't seal it. Instead, she handed it to Kirk. "Read it," she said, "but not now. Later, when you're ready to remember this exactly as it was, not as some Hollywood romance or scandal. What we had was real. Don't let anyone turn it into something cheap." Kirk took the letter, his hands uncharacteristically unsteady. "What are we doing, Marlene?" She smiled, sad and knowing. "We're being smart. You're going to be one of the greatest stars Hollywood has ever seen, Kirk. I can feel it. You have the drive, the talent, the hunger. But that kind of success requires sacrifice. You can't build an empire and maintain something like this. It would consume us both." Kirk wanted to argue. The part of him that never backed down from anything wanted to fight. But he knew she was right. "And you?" he asked. Marlene lit another cigarette. "I've already built my empire. I'm not interested in building another one. Ikuyak beautiful moments, Kirk. Experiences that matter. And then I let them go before they turn into obligations." They talked for another hour, both of them circling around the same truth. What they'd shared had been extraordinary precisely because it was temporary. Trying to make it permanent would kill what made it special. Kirk Douglas left Marlene Dietrich's house that afternoon knowing he'd never return. Not like this. They might see each other at parties, at premieres, at industry events. They'd be cordial, professional. But this, whatever this had been, was over. He took the letter with him. And for reasons he never fully explained, even to himself, Kirk Douglas didn't read it. Not that day. Not that week. He put away, sealed in an envelope, stored in a box that he'd keep for the next 60 years. Kirk Douglas met Anne Bidens 2 years later, in 1951. She was a publicist, smart and independent, the kind of woman who wasn't impressed by movie stars. She challenged him. She saw through his charm and demanded he be real with her. Kirk fell in love in a way he hadn't expected, and knew he'd had a complicated past, relationships that had ended badly, affairs that had meant nothing. But he never told her about Marlene Dietrich. Not in detail. Not in a way that would make her understand that those 3 days in 1949 had changed something fundamental in him. Kirk and Anne married in 1954 and stayed together for 66 years, until Kirk's death in 2020. It was one of Hollywood's rare successful marriages. They built a life together, raised a family, supported each other through decades of highs and lows. Kirk Douglas became exactly what Marlene had predicted. One of the greatest stars Hollywood ever produced. Spartacus, Paths of Glory, Lust for Life, Champion, a career that spanned decades and redefined what it meant to be a leading man. In 2019, 70 years after that March evening in Los Angeles, researchers at the Marlene Dietrich collection in Berlin were cataloging materials from her Paris apartment. Marlene had died in 1992, and her estate had been carefully preserved. Among her possessions were thousands of letters, photographs, journals, and personal items. The archivist had been working through the collection for years, but this particular box had been marked as private and set aside. When they finally opened it, they found something unexpected. A letter. Not the original that Marlene had written to Kirk in 1949. That letter had gone with him, never read, taken to his grave. This was different. This was a copy. Marlene had apparently written the letter twice. Once for Kirk, and once for herself. A record of what she'd wanted to say, preserved exactly as she'd said it. The letter was extraordinary, not because it was scandalous or revealed some dark secret, but because of what it showed about two people who'd understood each other completely and chosen to walk away. Marlene wrote about meeting Kirk and recognizing in him the same fierce independence that had defined her own life. She wrote about the 3 days they'd spent together and how she'd known, even in the middle of it, that it couldn't last. She wrote about why she was letting him go, not because she didn't care, but because she cared enough to want him to succeed on his own terms, without the complication of trying to maintain something that would eventually tear them both apart. She wrote about Hollywood and the way it devoured genuine connection, turning everything into performance and spectacle. She wrote about choice and sacrifice and what it meant to love someone enough to release them completely. The historians who read the letter were stunned. This wasn't the typical Hollywood affair story. There was no betrayal, no scandal, no dramatic ending. Just two remarkable people who'd found something real and made the difficult decision to preserve it by ending it. The letter explained so much. Why Kirk had never spoken about Marlene. Why she'd maintained that unusual silence about him. They'd made an unspoken pact to protect what they'd shared by keeping it completely private. In an industry built on publicity and image, they'd chosen to keep one thing sacred. Kirk Douglas lived to be 103 years old. He outlived most of his contemporaries, remained active until his final years, and left behind a legacy that extended far beyond his films. He was a family man, a philanthropist, someone who'd used his success to make a genuine difference. His marriage to and was, by all accounts, loving and solid. Michael Douglas spoke at his father's funeral about the kind of man Kirk had been. Complicated, demanding, but ultimately devoted to the people he loved. The letter from Marlene was found among Kirk's possessions after his death, still sealed in its original envelope. And Biden's, who died a year after Kirk, had apparently known about it. She'd respected his choice to keep it private, to maintain that one piece of his past that belonged only to him. The story of Kirk Douglas and Marlene Dietrich isn't about scandal or betrayal. It's about two extraordinary people who understood each other completely and made the difficult choice to part ways so they could both become who they were meant to be. Kirk became Spartacus, the rebel who defied an empire. Marlene remained the eternal icon, untamed and uncompromising. And somewhere between those two legends was a moment in 1949 when they'd found something real. A connection that was too powerful to sustain, but too meaningful to forget. They protected it for 70 years. And in doing so, they proved that sometimes the greatest love stories are the ones that end, not in tragedy, but in the wisdom to know when to let go. Hollywood has always been built on illusions. But what Kirk Douglas and Marlene Dietrich shared was the opposite of illusion. It was a moment of complete honesty between two people who rarely let their guards down. That's why they never spoke about it. That's why they guarded it so carefully. Because in an industry of performances, they'd found something genuine, and they loved it enough to keep it private. The letter that Marlene wrote wasn't a confession of scandal. It was a tribute to what they'd shared and a recognition that some things are too precious to parade in front of the world. Kirk Douglas carried that letter for 60 years, never reading it, but never discarding it either. A reminder of the woman who'd seen him completely and loved him enough to let him go. That kind of connection doesn't happen often. And when it does, perhaps the greatest act of love is knowing when to walk away.